DC started to call when they wanted me to do some of the covers for their science fiction line. Robert Bloch and for Bradbury. That I started doing some of those, and that was actually quite fun, to get noticed from another company, because I've always been freelance. I didn't like being beholden to anyone. I just wanted to do whatever I felt like doing. The comfort of knowing where the money was going to be coming from, like a monthly or a weekly check, that didn't interest me nearly so much because I felt if I did the work, the creative work, and I was excited about it, then the income would come. It was like, because I wasn't having trouble producing. And then when I did Electra Assassin, at the same time Frank and I were doing the Love and War graphic novel. That was supposed to, what turned into the Love and War graphic novel was supposed to be a regular arc of the comic book. And that was when I was pushing the Kingpin to these super extreme sort of Tex Avery shapes. And it was getting even more like weird and abstract. And it was actually Chris Claremont who, we kept the pages in Ralph Macchio, who's the editor's office, in the bottom file of the bottom drawer of the flat file. And we just kept it all from Jim. Like Jim had no idea. It was almost like he would see it when it was in its make ready, and which basically a make ready is sort of like the step right before it's actually in the stores. It would be without the cover, but it was all the coloring was there. It was just didn't have the cover, and we figured by then it's like too late to stop the presses. So there was a little bit of sort of like, let's see how far we can push these things and have fun. And Chris Claremont was the one who actually, said to Jim when Jim walked in, Jim, it's like, have you seen these pages, And Jim looked at them and his eyes just got really big and he said, no. And he called me into his office and he goes, this is not going to fly. He said, there's no way, because this is too unusual. It's too different for the continuity. He said, however, we've had some success with The Death of Captain Marvel by Jim Starlin as a graphic novel. So that kind of broke open the doors for graphic novels. And he said, you want to do as a graphic novel? And I was like, perfect, because I get a chance to paint that. So that became like the big thing Frank and I were going to do. We were going to play with the Kingpin and Daredevil and tell this very particular story. And then Frank said, well, why don't we do like an 8-issue or 6-issue story on Electra for like bread and butter, to put like food on the table while we're doing this big graphic novel project. So it was almost like Rubber Soul and Revolver. It was like they were like these things that were done kind of almost at the same time. I'm only using the Beatles comparison because of the time frame, between the two. They were literally almost salt and pepper shakers. Like they were done. One was or like Lucky Town, and what's the other one by the double album by Springsteen. They were like similar but different. So I was pushing things in a certain way, but with Electra I was also pushing a much longer sort of narrative arc as opposed to a sort of self-contained 48-page story. And for some reason I think knowing I had one to fall back on, I could sort of pick and choose where I was going to go crazier. I had a studio after getting divorced and being in a studio in my place in Norwalk. I moved out of Westport, moved into Norwalk, lived there by myself. And then I would also visit in Westport and stay and work with Stan Drake and Leonard Starr in their art studio. So, which was a huge deal for me. I loved their work. And I started to get to know a lot of the cartoonists in Westport. But at the same time, I also wanted to get an art studio in New York City and be around other artists. So I started working with Dennis Cowan and Michael Davis, and I got an art studio in this next room to Howard Chaykin, Walt Simonson, Jim Sherman, and what used to be Frank Miller's studio. Frank was no longer part of Upstarts, but I was in the same building working with them. And then I was involved with an artist named Mary Wilshire, and she lived uptown Manhattan, over on 86th Street. So when I would stay there, I'd wake up in the morning and then just get some coffee, and I would spend the day going to museums or to bookstores, and I was just a sponge. I was drawing, I was sketching, I was photography, and then I would slowly make my way down to 29th Street. And by the time it was like 4 o'clock, I'd get something to eat, and then I'd just dive in. And by the time I would, like, from the day of walking and just sort of percolating with all this stuff, I would literally sit down and just pour it out on the paper. I literally had no idea how, like, what was going on. Like, it was out of my frame of reference. You know, I would look at a piece and go, I just need to do it this way. I was as much a passenger as the guy doing it. I was like, I'm looking at my hands, and it's, you know, I couldn't make any critical assessments because I didn't know if it worked or not. I didn't know what it was. And certainly I couldn't expect people who weren't in my own head to figure it out, you know. I mean, if I couldn't decide what it was, and other people couldn't either. So the editors, I mean, Joe Duffy, who was an amazing editor, and you know, the great departed Archie Goodwin, I mean, who was just such an amazing man. He and Joe were just so supportive of pushing and, you know, finding our way. So it became this really unusual way of doing things, you know, for Frank and I. And Joe Duffy would even say, like, you know, Bill's here in the office, he's got some pages. There are pages because they technically are on paper, you know. I don't know what they are. So Frank would rewrite. I mean, I would get a script, I would get excited, and then I would run with it. Frank would see my pages that I would do, and then he would run with it. And it sort of became this back and forth, this tennis match. The experience of working with Frank, certainly working with Chris, you know, it was wonderful as well. But with Frank, because we were doing 2 projects concurrently, it was like, you know, we became like, I mean, I feel like I've been fortunate to say I'm like family with these creative guys, you know, like brothers. It's like, but with Frank and I mean, I just remember laughing like crazy when we were doing this stuff, because we thought we're really pushing it. It's like people are gonna love this stuff. It's like, you know, it's like we're gonna blow their mind. And when the book came out, there was silence. It was like nothing. And we thought, okay, well, we went off the rails there.